It was a crisp Wednesday morning in Maplewood Estates, a tidy suburban neighborhood in Virginia where every lawn was manicured and every mailbox gleamed. At 10:43 a.m., I was on my porch, sipping black coffee and enjoying the quiet hum of a day off. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass, and the only sound was the distant buzz of a lawnmower. Then came the crunch of gravel under boots and the faint whine of a battery-powered angle grinder. I thought it was just another utility crew until I saw her, Margaret, the HOA president, striding toward my yard like she was leading a military operation. Her mirrored sunglasses glinted in the sun, and she was flanked by two board members and a guy in a bright orange vest clutching bolt cutters that looked like they belonged in a heist movie. My heart sank when I realized their target, my ammo locker. Not just any locker, but a federally licensed, military-registered, bolted-down steel box that held sensitive files from my days as a defense contractor. It was wired to a Department of Defense, DoD, alert system, designed to ping Virginia servers if anyone so much as sneezed on it. Margaret, however, didn't care about that. She raised her clipboard like a scepter and announced, "Mr. Thompson, this structure violates HOA Code 3.11b for unauthorized metal containers visible from the sidewalk. You were notified. We're seizing it." Her confidence was almost comical, like she thought her title gave her the power to rewrite federal law. I stood up, coffee mug still in hand, and tried to explain. "Margaret, this isn't just a locker. It's under DoD oversight. It's got a live alert system. Touching it will trigger a response you don't want." She smirked, the kind of smirk that said she'd heard it all before and didn't believe a word. "Nice try," she said, nodding to the orange vest guy, who leaned in with the bolt cutters. The moment the cutters clamped onto the lock, a red light blinked on the locker's panel. Somewhere, a signal pulsed out, and I knew things were about to get interesting. Margaret didn't notice. She turned to her board members, gloating. "See? Nothing's happening. He's probably just storing fishing gear." One of them chuckled. I stayed quiet, watching the sky, waiting for what I knew was coming. 15 minutes later, the neighborhood shook with the roar of two matte black SUVs tearing down the street. No logos, no plates, just government-issued menace. They screeched to a halt in front of my yard, and 4 men in tactical gear spilled out, earpieces crackling. "Perimeter check. Secure the site. Drone scan now," barked the leader, a lieutenant with a voice like gravel. Margaret's clipboard hit the grass. She gasped, then tried to recover with, "Hi, I'm the HOA president. We were just—" "Ma'am, step away from the structure." The lieutenant cut her off. "This is a protected asset under federal code. You've committed a breach." Margaret's mouth flapped like a fish out of water. One officer pulled out a tablet, swiping through alert logs. One attempted breach. Images transmitted to an unknown cloud server. "That's a violation." Margaret stammered, pointing at the orange vest guy. "I didn't upload anything." "He did it, but the officer wasn't buying it." "Ma'am, your surveillance footage says otherwise." "I'd installed my own cameras months ago, layered and looping, because I knew Margaret's type, petty tyrants who think rules only apply to others." The officers didn't cuff her, but they escorted her and her bolt cutter buddy to the sidewalk, radioing in their IDs for background checks. The lieutenant turned to me, his face softening just enough to show respect. "You did the right thing, not engaging directly. This is why the system exists." I nodded, asking, "What happens now?" He glanced at Margaret, who was sweating through her blazer. "We investigate who authorized this. If she doesn't have clearance, this goes federal." By noon, the SUVs were gone, and Margaret stood staring at the locker like it had personally betrayed her. She tried one last jab, shouting about a neighborhood vote and dangerous items near children. I waved her off and went inside, but I kept my cameras rolling. People like Margaret don't quit. They double down. That evening, I reviewed the footage. Margaret had leaned into the locker like a cat burglar, even snapping selfies. One was geotagged, and because her phone synced to the HOA's cloud, those images hit an unsecured server. That's what triggered the second alert, not just local, but federal. I noted to upgrade my camera storage and rotate the locker's passcode. The next morning, an encrypted email from a DoD liaison confirmed the breach protocols had kicked in. They requested my surveillance footage for potential federal court proceedings and included a document stating the HOA had zero jurisdiction over my locker. I grinned. Karma was serving itself on a silver platter. Margaret came by later, clipboard in hand, fake smile plastered on. "Let's move past this. Maybe relocate the locker behind a fin for appearances." I looked her dead in the eye. The only thing getting relocated is your HOA badge. Maybe to evidence. She huffed and stormed off, but I knew she wasn't done. This was just the beginning. The fallout from that Wednesday morning spread through Maplewood Estates like wildfire. By Friday, the cul-de-sac was buzzing with whispers and sidelong glances. Neighbors who usually waved cheerfully now avoided eye contact, their morning jogs and dog walks tinged with unease. The black SUVs had left an impression, and Margaret's failed raid on my locker was the talk of every driveway. But Margaret wasn't one to slink away quietly. She was already spinning a new narrative, one that painted me as the villain and her as the neighborhood's savior. That morning, I found a flyer taped to my mailbox. It was a poorly designed thing, printed on neon yellow paper with a stock photo of a rusty grenade in the background. The headline screamed, "Emergency Safety Meeting, Addressing the Threat in Our Midst." I didn't need to read the fine print to know who the threat was supposed to be. Margaret had scheduled an HOA meeting for that evening at the community center, framing it as a critical intervention to protect Maplewood from what she called a military hazard. It was theatrical, even for her, but it was also a bold move to regain control of the narrative. I decided to attend, not because I wanted to, but because letting Margaret control the room unchecked was a recipe for disaster. When I walked into the community center, the air was thick with tension. Plastic chairs creaked as heads turned, and the room fell silent. Margaret stood at the front, her posture rigid, flanked by Harold, the HOA treasurer, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. She welcomed everyone with a saccharine smile, as if she'd single-handedly saved us all from doom. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," she began. "As you know, a dangerous situation unfolded in our community involving unauthorized military materials stored on private property." She paused for effect, her eyes locking onto me with a rehearsed gasp. "While I can't share details due to ongoing investigations, we must prioritize the safety of our children, our property values, and our peace of mind." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone in the back muttered, "Weren't you the one with the bolt cutters?" Margaret ignored it, clicking a remote to advance her PowerPoint. The next slide showed a blurry photo of the SUVs parked in front of my house, likely snapped by Harold's shaky hand. "This," she said, "is what our neighborhood has become, a place where unmarked vehicles show up because of secrets stored next to swing sets." I couldn't take it anymore. I stood, my voice calm but firm. For the record, those vehicles showed up because someone broke federal protocol by photographing and attempting to dismantle a secured, government-registered locker. They didn't come for me. They came because someone triggered a federal breach. I held up a printout of the DoD letter confirming the locker's protected status. "This isn't about swing sets. It's about someone ignoring the law." Margaret tried to interrupt, but I kept going. "Maplewood Estates isn't above federal law, and neither is your HOA. You all deserve safety, and I've kept this quiet to ensure that." It wasn't a risk until someone made it one. The room buzzed. A few neighbors nodded, and one guy in the back clapped awkwardly before stopping himself. Margaret's face tightened, but she pressed on, insisting the neighborhood had a right to decide what was appropriate. Harold chimed in, "This isn't a military base. It's Maplewood Estates." I turned to the crowd. "And Maplewood Estates doesn't get to rewrite federal law." The meeting ended in chaos, with neighbors arguing among themselves. Margaret's attempt to rally support backfired, but she wasn't done. By the next morning, my phone buzzed with a restricted call. It was Homeland Security. They wanted to verify a report Margaret had submitted through a public portal, claiming I was running a rogue weapons depot. She'd included photos, a video, and a mini-documentary-style rant about my terror-like behavior. It was absurd, but it was also serious enough to bring 2 agents to my doorstep. They arrived in suits, polite but all business, carrying credentials that screamed authority. We spoke in my garage, where the locker stood untouched. I showed them my security footage, the DoD email trail, and my old contractor clearance. They didn't ask about weapons probably because they already knew what the locker held: encrypted files and ballistic storage data from my DoD projects. What they wanted to know was how Margaret got access to the content. I explained her phone synced to the HOA's cloud server, which triggered a metadata scan that flagged a government file index. One agent leaned forward. "So her photos uploaded to a shared platform. That's what escalated this." I nodded. "Exactly. They took notes, citing statutes and muttering about security violations." As they left, one said, "Most people don't try to seize federal hardware over landscaping disputes." I laughed, but the weight of it lingered. Margaret wasn't just a nuisance, she was a liability. That evening, Harold posted a rant in the HOA forum, accusing me of weaponizing the government and calling me a military snitch. The post was shared 50 times, and one neighbor started a petition to remove me from the neighborhood for endangering the peace. This wasn't about a locker anymore. It was war. I started compiling evidence. Every HOA complaint, screenshot, and video clip. I labeled the binder defense, not out of fear, but because Margaret had crossed a line into paranoia. She turned a neighborhood squabble into a federal incident, and I wasn't about to let her rewrite history. The next morning, I woke to the rumble of a diesel engine. Peering out my window, I saw a flatbed truck and a small bulldozer at the edge of my driveway. Margaret stood nearby in her robe, clutching a flashlight like a baton. Her cousin, a shady contractor from a botched HOA project, was unloading the bulldozer, gesturing toward my locker. They weren't bluffing, they were going to tear it out. Margaret was on her phone, whispering about before sunrise and no cameras active. She thought she'd outsmarted me. She didn't know the locker had motion sensors. The second her cousin stepped near it, alerts pinged the DOD, local police, and my phone. I stormed outside, shouting over the engine, "Have you lost your mind, Margaret?" She smirked. "This is HOA land now. The board voted this as hazardous equipment. We're removing it for safety." It was a lie so blatant it was almost admirable. No vote, no paperwork, just raw force. Before I could say more, a voice cut through the dawn. "Stop the vehicle. Move away from the structure." Two police officers stepped out of a patrol car, one with a hand on his holster. Margaret froze. Her cousin killed the engine. A third vehicle pulled up base security from the nearby military installation. The lead officer, clipboard in hand, demanded names. Margaret tried to pin it on her cousin, claiming she was just supervising for safety. Her cousin, sweating, asked if a federal offense meant jail time. The officer's response was ice cold. Attempting to remove a federally monitored container violates Title 50. Your emails, turned over by another board member, show premeditation. Neighbors began gathering, coffee mugs in hand, watching Margaret unravel. Her cousin was detained for trespassing, and the truck was impounded after officers found tools labeled with a fake company name. Margaret was told to stay on her porch pending questioning. The community center was locked down that afternoon, with a forensic cyber unit combing through HOA records. Margaret had been accessing my property registry illegally, and it was all coming to light. The neighborhood was a powder keg by Monday morning. The air felt charged, like the calm before a storm. Margaret's bulldozer stunt had backfired spectacularly, and the sight of her cousin being detained while neighbors gawked from their porches was the kind of gossip that didn't fade over a weekend. Maplewood Estates, once a haven of predictable suburban routine, was now a stage for whispered accusations and uneasy glances. But Margaret wasn't done. If anything, her obsession with my locker seemed to grow, fueled by her refusal to admit defeat. I found a letter taped to my front door that morning, printed on cheap letterhead from a Maplewood compliance agency. It cited violations, improper storage of hazardous materials, obstruction of public aesthetics, and uncooperative behavior during community safety reviews. The letter was laughable. There was no such agency. A quick call to a contact in federal property oversight confirmed my suspicion. It was a fake, just a name Margaret had conjured to make her vendetta look official. The P.O. box and Gmail address listed were dead ends. I scanned the letter and sent it to the DOD liaison, adding it to the growing pile of evidence. Later that day, I caught two HOA board members, Carl and Susan, creeping around my property with a measuring tape and a drone. They claimed they were verifying distances for easement updates, but their nervous glances at the locker told a different story. Carl, the bolder of the two, pointed at it and said, "You should just get rid of it, Tom. We can't have military stuff here. People are talking." I crossed my arms. Are they also talking about the military convoy that showed up because Margaret broke federal law? Carl stared at his shoes, mumbling about keeping the peace. I shook my head. Peace comes from respecting the law, not ignoring it. That afternoon, the stakes climbed higher. A knock on my door revealed a military officer in dress uniform, accompanied by a legal liaison from the Judge Advocate General's Court, JAG. They introduced themselves with crisp handshakes and led me to my living room. The liaison handed me a cease and desist order addressed to the Maplewood Estates HOA. It was blunt. Any further interference with my locker would be considered obstruction under multiple federal statutes. An attached summary outlined potential legal action against the board. I asked what was next. The officer's face was unreadable. "We're reviewing the HOA's activities for violations." Depending on what we find, the entire board could face charges, not just Margaret. I mentioned the fake compliance letter. The officer raised an eyebrow. That's fraud. Add it to the list. As they left, he took photos of my property and jotted down GPS coordinates. This wasn't just a courtesy call, it was case building. Word of the JAG visit spread like wildfire. By evening, the HOA group chat was a war zone. Some neighbors defended Margaret, claiming she was protecting property values. Others demanded her resignation, with one posting, "We need to dump Margaret before this goes nuclear." Screenshots leaked of her private messages to the board, urging them to stand their ground and insisting they can't arrest all of us. It was arrogance mixed with panic, the words of someone watching her empire crumble. The next morning, I woke to the sound of metal clanking outside. A pickup truck with a trailer was backing onto my lawn, and two men in work gloves were unloading a hydraulic jack, straps, and a winch. They were going for the locker. I bolted outside, shouting, "You touch that, and the military won't be the only ones coming. That's felony theft of federal property." One guy stammered, "We were hired for a pickup job." The HOA said this was abandoned. I pointed to the locker's sign, "Federal asset. Unauthorized access prohibited under Title 50. You missed the part where it says felony." They scrambled back to their truck and sped off. I called the JAG officer, sending him doorcam footage with the truck's license plate. Margaret had escalated from trespassing to attempted theft. That evening, an unexpected visitor showed up, Lucas, a quiet HOA board member who always seemed out of place in Margaret's circle. He looked pale, clutching a folder. "I didn't sign up for this," he said. "Margaret told us you were storing explosives. She said we'd be liable if we didn't act." He handed me the folder, filled with internal emails. Margaret had discussed pressuring the homeowner into compliance, and even joked about bankrupting me. She called the locker my toy war box. It was damning and cruel. I scanned the emails and sent them to JAG, backing them up on a secure drive. Lucas apologized and left, head down. Margaret wasn't just an over her head, she was dragging the board down with her. She'd mistaken her HOA title for a crown, but the feds were closing in, and her own board was turning on her. I stepped onto my porch, staring at the locker. It wasn't just steel, Anna Marie, it was a symbol of every line Margaret had crossed, every lie she'd told. But the fight wasn't over. She was too stubborn to quit, and I knew she'd try something else. The neighborhood felt like it was holding its breath. People mowed their lawns with one eye on my driveway, as if expecting another convoy. The tension was palpable, but so was the shift. Margaret's grip was slipping, and the community was starting to see her for what she was, a bully with a clipboard. I kept my cameras rolling, my binder updated, and my resolve steady. This wasn't just about protecting my property anymore. It was about showing that no one, not even an HOA president, was above the law. The days following the pickup truck incident felt like the neighborhood was walking on eggshells. Maplewood Estates had never been so quiet, yet so tense. The usual chatter of kids on bikes and neighbors swapping gardening tips was replaced by hushed conversations and stolen glances toward my driveway. Margaret's latest stunt, hiring goons to haul off my locker, had pushed things past the point of petty HOA drama. It was now a full-blown crisis, and the community was starting to fracture under the weight of her obsession. By Tuesday, the HOA board was in shambles. The emergency meeting that evening wasn't about making decisions, it was about survival. One by one, board members stood up to resign, citing Margaret's deception and reckless misuse of power. Carl, who'd been caught snooping with a drone, muttered an apology about just following orders. Susan, usually Margaret's cheerleader, said she'd been misled about the locker's dangers. Even Harold, the treasurer who'd backed Margaret's PowerPoint fiasco, distanced himself, claiming he'd only gone along to avoid conflict. The room was a sea of bowed heads and nervous coughs, but Margaret sat defiant, her arms crossed, her jaw set like she was daring anyone to challenge her. When it was her turn to speak, she stood and launched into a tirade. "I was trying to protect this neighborhood," she declared, her voice trembling with self-righteous fury. "We can't have secret military equipment endangering our children." But the crowd wasn't buying it. Someone handed her a printed list of federal statutes she'd violated, complete with timestamps and email attachments. Her face went pale, and for the first time, she had no comeback. The board voted unanimously to remove her as president permanently. She stormed out, shouting, "This isn't over." But the silence that followed said otherwise. Her reign was crumbling, and everyone knew it. The next morning, I received a summons from Homeland Security. They wanted me to attend a private meeting at a secure facility 45 minutes outside the city. I drove through rolling Virginia hills, my mind racing with what this could mean. At the facility, 2 men in suits greeted me with firm handshakes and led me to a stark conference room. They laid out the situation with clinical precision. Margaret's selfies and uploads had briefly connected to a server tied to ongoing DoD operations. It wasn't intentional, but the metadata breach had triggered a data scrub protocol that nearly disrupted a critical program. This isn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore, one agent said. It's a national security issue. They were impressed by my restraint, how I'd let the system handle Margaret instead of confronting her directly. Then came the surprise. They offered me a part-time consulting role, working remotely to educate civilians on federal infrastructure storage protocols. We need people like you to prevent more Margarets from pulling the pin on grenades they don't understand, the agent said. I accepted, not just for the job, but because it felt like a way to turn this mess into something constructive. Back in Maplewood, the neighborhood was trying to heal. A special election was called to replace the HOA board, and for once, the candidates weren't promising fines or power grabs. They talked about transparency, fairness, and letting people live in their homes without fear of a clipboard tyrant. A retired firefighter named Ellen won the presidency, and her first act was to propose eliminating the bylaw Margaret had weaponized against my locker. At the meeting, I sat quietly, watching as residents voted unanimously to strike the aesthetic authority clause. No one clapped, but the relief in the room was palpable. Margaret, however, wasn't fading quietly. A federal summons arrived at her door that week, charging her with obstruction, illegal surveillance, attempted destruction of federal property, and unauthorized access to secure databases. Her cousin, the bulldozer guy, was still being questioned about shady contracts, and his detention sent ripples through the neighborhood. Parents deleted their kids from Margaret's Facebook group, and Harold's public apology in the HOA newsletter only deepened the divide. The woman who'd once ruled Maplewood with an iron fist was now a pariah. One afternoon, I found an envelope in my mailbox. No return address, just a handwritten note inside. You were right. I should have listened. I lost everything. The handwriting matched a welcome note Margaret had left when I moved in years ago, back when she was just a nosy neighbor, not a wannabe dictator. I folded it and tucked it into my binder, not out of pity, but as a reminder of how power can corrupt when it's unchecked. The locker stood untouched, a silent sentinel in my yard. I didn't move it or hide it behind a fence, as Margaret had always demanded. Instead, I added a new sign below the federal tag. Stand here if you've read the Constitution. It became a neighborhood joke, with kids pointing it out and adults chuckling as they passed. But it was more than a jokey, it was a line in the sand, a reminder that rules exist for a reason, and no one gets to rewrite them to suit their ego. As the weeks passed, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. No more citations, no more drones buzzing overhead, no more Margaret pacing the sidewalks with her clipboard. The silence was fragile, but it was real. Ellen's new board held open meetings, and people actually showed up, not out of fear, but because they wanted to rebuild what Margaret had broken. I started my consulting work, training communities on federal compliance, and found it oddly fulfilling. It wasn't about revenge, it was about prevention, ensuring no one else would face what I had. But the story wasn't over. Margaret's trial was coming, and though it would be handled quietly, as federal cases often are, the neighborhood was watching. Her actions had left scars, and people were still grappling with what it meant to have let her rule for so long. The locker, once just a piece of steel, had become a symbol of resistance, a testament to standing firm against overreach. And as I sat on my porch, sipping coffee, I knew the final chapter was still to come. The weeks leading up to Margaret's trial were a strange mix of calm and anticipation in Maplewood Estates. The neighborhood had begun to heal, but the scars of her reign lingered. Porch lights no longer flickered with suspicion, and the HOA's group chat, once a battleground, now hosted debates about community picnics and trash pickup schedules. Ellen, the new HOA president, led with a steady hand, prioritizing open dialogue over petty citations. Yet, the shadow of Margaret's actions hung over us, a reminder of how quickly order could unravel when power was misused. The locker in my yard stood firm, its new sign, "Stand here if you've read the Constitution," drawing smiles from neighbors who'd once avoided my gaze. It had become a quiet symbol of defiance, a testament to standing up to overreach. Margaret's trial was handled behind closed doors, as federal cases often are, but word trickled out through hushed conversations and leaked documents. She'd pleaded guilty to multiple charges: obstruction, illegal surveillance, attempted destruction of federal property, and unauthorized access to secure databases. The penalties were steep: a hefty fine, federal monitoring, and a 15-year ban from serving on any housing or administrative board. Her cousin, caught in the bulldozer fiasco, faced his own legal troubles for operating without a contractor's license and was barred from working in the state. The news spread like wildfire, and by the time the verdict was finalized, Margaret's name was synonymous with cautionary tales told over backyard barbecues. I didn't celebrate. There was no joy in watching someone's life implode, even someone as relentless as Margaret. But there was closure. The neighborhood had learned a hard lesson about the difference between leadership and control, between community and tyranny. Ellen's board passed new bylaws requiring transparency in all HOA decisions, and they set up a resident feedback system to prevent another Margaret from rising unchecked. People started showing up to meetings, not out of fear, but because they wanted to be part of something better. Kids rode their bikes past my house again, some stopping to read the locker's sign and giggle. The tension that had gripped Maplewood for months was finally fading, replaced by a cautious optimism. One evening, as I sat on my porch, I reflected on the journey. The locker wasn't just a steel box, Anna Maria, it was a line in the sand, a reminder that no one, no matter their title, could trample on rights without consequence. My consulting work with the DoD was picking up, and I'd already trained 2 communities on federal compliance protocols. It felt good to turn this mess into something positive, to ensure no one else would face a Margaret armed with a clipboard and a vendetta. I'd even started joining the neighborhood barbecues again, swapping stories with folks who'd once kept their distance. They asked about the locker, half joking, half curious, and I'd tell them just enough to keep the mystery alive. A few weeks after the trial, I found myself at the community center for a town hall meeting. Ellen was presenting plans for a new playground, and the room was packed with residents, their faces lit with ideas rather than fear. Someone asked about the locker, and Ellen smiled. Tom's locker is his business, and it's protected by law. Let's focus on swing sets, not steel boxes. The crowd laughed, and for the first time, I felt like Maplewood was truly moving on. The final piece of the puzzle came unexpectedly. One morning, as I checked my mailbox, I found a small package. Inside was a handwritten letter from Lucas, the board member who'd turned over Margaret's emails. "I'm moving away," he wrote. "This place isn't the same, but it's better because of you. Thanks for standing your ground." Tucked inside was a tiny model of a padlock, a nod to the locker that had started it all. I chuckled, placing it on my mantle next to the binder labeled Defense. It was a fitting memento, a reminder that battles aren't won with fists, but with resolve and evidence. Maplewood Estates was never the same after that summer. The locker remained, untouched and unapologetic, a quiet sentinel in my yard. Neighbors began to see it not as a threat, but as a symbol of resilience, a reminder that rights matter, and so does the truth. I kept my cameras rolling, just in case, but the need for them felt less urgent. The neighborhood had found its footing, and I'd found my place in it not as the guy who fought the HOA, but as the guy who showed it could be done. As I write this, I'm sitting on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the sun set over Maplewood. The air smells of fresh-cut grass again, and the distant hum of a lawnmower feels like home. Margaret's gone, her clipboard a relic of a bygone era. The locker stands, not because I need it to, but because it's a reminder. No one gets to rewrite the rules just because they think they can. Justice worked, not with fanfare, but with quiet, relentless precision. And in the end, that's what made all the difference. Thank you for following this journey through Maplewood Estates, a story of one man's stand against overreach and the power of standing firm. What do you think about this tale? Have you ever faced a situation where someone tried to bend the rules to control others? How do you view the balance between community safety and personal rights? And what about the role of power? When does leadership become tyranny? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's spark a conversation about justice, authority, and standing up to bullies in our lives. Your perspective matters. Tell us where you stand.